Okay, so in this video lesson, we're going to be tackling Antinous. So I've actually sped the video up here because I do actually do a couple of portraits in this one. So what I'm doing is I'm starting with a square because his head fits into the shape of a square from multiple different angles, actually. So I'm just kind of finding the extreme measures, like the edge of the hair to the other side of the head, and basically what I'm doing now is I'm just trying to find the position of the neck. So I've kind of added a bit more distance onto the height. And that line that I drew at the bottom, that's basically where I believe the neck to lie. And then once you've got that, you basically just want to start sketching in the silhouette. Just a rough sketch, okay? Like, it doesn't have to be perfect. You really just want to kind of find these proportions. But I do want to quickly explain that square. So the square, the top of the head, from this particular angle that I'm drawing in, if you measure the top of the head to the bottom of the jawline, that is actually equal distances with each side of the head, okay? So that basically makes it square. And then once I've constructed that square, once I've found that measurement, you can see me right now, I'm actually just plotting in the rest of the face in relation to those larger proportions, and I'm kind of just sketching it in. I'm not being too precise about this because, I kind of want to get through the stage fairly quickly. And, you can always change things as the drawing progresses, so you don't have to be a perfectionist about this kind of stuff. But you can see, like, as I'm beginning to sketch the face in, you can kind of see it appearing from the page a bit more. But I'm only using simple lines. Like, I'm just using, very quick, curved, straight lines. I'm not drawing any kind of detail. And then in this part, I'm just kind of mapping out the proportions of the face. So the proportions are actually the same as Aphrodite that we did in the last video lesson. So you can actually divide the distance between the hairline and the chin into 3 equal spaces. But just remember that Antinous actually has quite a low hairline. The curls of his hair are almost, they almost reach his eyebrows, okay? They almost reach his brow line. So his hairline needs to be placed higher up in order to divide those distances into equal parts. So I found the base of the eyebrows, I found the base of the nose. If you divide the distance between the base of the nose and the chin in half, you'll actually find the location of the bottom lip. And then once you've found these proportions, what you want to do is you just want to adjust them very slightly, because even though we use the classical proportions in this drawing, they're not quite exact in the reference, okay? And they do change, they do vary from person to person. So once you've mapped them in, just try to adjust them a little bit according to the drawing. So then I'm just kind of like sketching in the position of the base of the nose, and also I'm sketching in the position of the eyeballs. Without actually drawing the eyes, you'll notice that I'm actually using like a lot of dashed lines in this stage, okay? I'm not completing the silhouette. I'm not drawing details. I'm not drawing eyelids or anything like that. I'm using very basic shapes. You can see here I'm actually drawing the actual eyeballs. So the eyeball typically lines up with the brow ridge, and then it sits just a bit more than halfway up the nose. And so by drawing that, you'll find the width of the eyeball. But again, if you've been studying proportions, and you can Google the classical proportions and study them from different sculptures. The more you know the proportions, and the more the distances between each part of the anatomy on the face, the better you're going to be able to draw. And even in this stage, I'm still keeping things very simple. I'm kind of simplifying the anatomy into very simplified forms. And the reason I do that is because I can focus more on proportion and less on detail. I can add the details in later on. But right now, this is all about plotting and locating the placement of these things. Once you've actually plotted out the features of the face, that's when you can actually begin to start just kind of refining those edges and sort of refining those details. So you can see that I'm just sort of shaping the mouth. I'm getting the chin in there now and just trying to construct the shape of the chin as well. So I'm trying to think about that three-dimensional form and where everything attaches to. And this whole time, you'll notice that I'm actually jumping around all over the canvas, okay? Like, I'm not trying to stay too long in one specific area. I'm actually drawing different parts all the time. Like, I'm just jumping in between the details. So right now, I'm just kind of sketching in the eyelids, making sure that they look good. Then just kind of refining the brows. And then I'm kind of going in and just refining that silhouette of the hair. Still keeping it fairly loose, you know, like I'm not getting into the really small shapes, but I'm just kind of drawing by feeling at this point, you know, like I'm not being too precise with the measurements here. I'm just kind of drawing what I think looks good when it comes to the hair curls. And same on the hairline there, you know, like I'm still keeping it accurate enough. It still looks like the sculpture, but when it comes to details like hair and hair curls, you can actually loosen up a little bit. So long as you make it look three-dimensional, okay? As long as you're constructing these forms and making them look 3D and you're thinking about the 3D form, it's going to look good, you know? It doesn't have to be a carbon copy of your reference. And, you know, I always say that, you know, like straight up copying is a very bad habit. You know, if you're just copying the positive and negative shapes of the image, then you can't really ever learn how to draw these kinds of things from imagination, which, you know, again, is the ultimate goal. You always want to be thinking three-dimensionally. So now I'm just kind of getting in those hair curls, like within the hair, and I'm still trying to... So I've kind of moved from the large shape into the slightly smaller shapes, okay? Again, not going too detailed, but just trying to find those bigger shapes. And then once I've plotted those hair curls in there, now I can actually start refining some of the planes of the face and some of the planes of the hair as well. And now I'm actually just kind of like refining the line work. I think the planes of the face have already been mapped out at this stage. I was recording, but I think I ran out of space on my phone, so unfortunately it didn't actually record that part. But basically, when it comes to drawing the planes of the face, you're just trying to think where each plane attaches into the next, okay? It's actually a very complicated subject, and there's actually no real right way to do it, to be honest. It's because planes can change depending on, you know, different types of people, and not to mention that the human body moves around all the time. So it's quite a complicated one to teach. But the biggest tip I can give you when it comes to plane changes is pay attention to the shadow shapes, because they typically give you clues as to what those planes are, okay? So anything like shadow shapes or half tones, pay very careful attention to them because they tend to reveal the shape of the plane on the face. That's the thing, like if the light or if the tone on an object changes, then that means that the plane has changed, basically. And I'm actually doing the same with the hair now, you know, like I'm not sketching in the shadow shapes of the hair. I'm actually just trying to think about those plane changes a little bit more, like where the object turns, where the light sort of cuts off in certain areas. So if you can start like detailing the planes first, then you can draw the cast shadows on top of them. That's typically the method that I use. And then typically my cast shadows tend to look a lot better when I do it that way. And then this is basically the linear stage complete, okay? So this is the linear drawing. You could just leave it like this if you really wanted to. So I'm just going to let this part of the video just play out. Okay, so here we go. So now I'm actually toning the figure, okay? So now when it comes to shadow shapes, basically I just tone them with the same general tone. Both shades and cast shadows, you know? Like to begin with the initial layer, I just kind of shade them all very lightly with a similar looking tone. And I keep my hatching strokes very light because I don't want to bury the line work. The line work is actually really important because it's actually revealing all the shapes to me. So I want to keep that visible so that as I continue to tone the drawing, I can actually see where all of those plane changes are, where all the small shadows and all the details are. So it's very important that in this initial toning stage that you do not tone or shade too darkly, because otherwise you're just going to end up burying that line work that you spent so long trying to do. It doesn't really make sense when you think of it like that. And then once you've done that, what I'm doing right now is I'm basically separating the cast shadows from the shades, okay? So a cast shadow, you'll remember, is a shadow that's being cast from one object onto another. So in this case, the most obvious example is the shadow of the nose, right? The shadow of the nose is being cast onto the mouth. So that cast shadow is rendered a little bit darker than the shades. A shade is simply a plane that is not facing the light, so therefore it doesn't receive any light at all. In this example, it would be his lower jaw, you know, like none of that is receiving any light. It's completely in shade. So, yeah, so typically during this stage, I just shade all of the cast shadows. I give them all an extra layer of hatching strokes. And then the drawing kind of looks beautiful in this stage, actually. I really like it because when you separate the cast shadows from the shades, it really kind of reveals the three-dimensional structure of what you're drawing. So I really like this stage for that reason. Bear in mind as well that aerial perspective is always important. So just remember that anything in the foreground, both shadows and darks, they're or shadows and lights, sorry, I should say, there's going to be more contrast in the foreground compared to everything in the background. So, like the back of the hair, for example, that should look as if it's like fading away onto the page. So you don't want to go too dark. But his face, you can actually really push the contrast in the tones on his face. And you can kind of see how, especially like in the eye sockets there, like how 3D they start to look when you do it that way. You can kind of see all of those different plane changes. And so that's why I think, linear drawing is a very good skill to master, because you think three-dimensionally. You can still see the line work, like it still looks like a drawing. It doesn't look like a photo or anything, but, that's not really the point, like photorealism I don't really think it makes you a better artist. And I actually speak from experience, because I used to do a lot of, I suppose you'd call it like hyperrealism, those sorts of drawings. But I don't do those anymore, just because I hated it. Like I was just a reference slave, basically. Like I'd always be a slave to the reference, and I couldn't draw from imagination at all. I couldn't actually come up with anything original. So that's the dangers of hyperrealism for you. Not that there's anything wrong with being a hyperrealist artist, but, it's not really for me. And, you might say, well, I'm using a reference for this drawing. It's like, yeah, sure, but I'm kind of drawing more with expression, and I'm kind of relying more on what I know rather than what I see. My drawing looks quite different from the actual reference image. But, I kind of like that, because it gives the drawing its own little personal touch, like it's distinctly mine, I guess. And again, because I am thinking in terms of three-dimensional construction, I could potentially draw this figure from my mind, like the classical proportions are just buried into my subconscious at this point. So, and that's why I think it's such an important skill to learn them, because you can actually develop characters from your head, which I think is just an awesome skill to have. So that's basically the front view completed. So now I'm going to do the side view. Okay, so I'm actually starting with a square. I'm drawing with a perfect square. I'm measuring everything, making sure it's equal. Because, as I said before, his head, if you study the reference and you measure, the back and the front of his head and the top of the bottom, where his bottom jawline is, it fits neatly into a square. It really does. And it kind of does that at multiple different angles. Probably doesn't do it at every single angle, but definitely does in this one. So now I'm kind of measuring the distance between the front of the face and the front of the neck, and like trying to count how many times that fits into the overall width. And I do that with multiple different parts, like the hairline as well, for example. Like I measure the distance between the hairline and the top of the head, and then I just count how many times that fits into the image. And then by doing it that way, I can kind of have a little bit more control over the proportions of the drawing. But once I've got my main silhouette sort of mapped in, I then just start drawing with feeling, basically. Like I just draw with expression, and I try to just estimate where things are going. And it doesn't mean that it's going to be perfect. Like there's certainly going to be mistakes when I do that, but mistakes don't always look bad. That's another thing that artists need to learn as well. Like sometimes, as long as you're drawing expressively and you're drawing with feeling, and you're always thinking about the 3D construction of the head, I think it's going to look good. Doesn't really matter if there's any kind of minor errors. As long as your main proportions are in place and everything appears where it should be, then you're not going to get a bad drawing out of that. But it does take a lot of practice. And the only way to get good at that is really just a lot of quick sketching, to be honest. There's no real other way. You just have to sketch so much to the point where you're just used to finding and seeing all of these different proportions. So again, I've got my main proportions mapped in. I've got the base of the nose, the brow line, the chin line. I'm kind of marking where the lips are going. And right now I'm just trying to draw the eye socket. So, and that's another tip, actually. Try to draw the eye sockets or like the position of the eye sockets before you actually draw the eyes. Again, you want to be always working from the biggest shapes to the smaller shapes, not the other way around. If you start working too small too fast, then you typically start losing control of the entire drawing. So try to teach your brain to work from large to small. That's really the ultimate goal. And and this philosophy of working from large to small, I apply that to those shapes in the hair as well. You can see that I'm mapping out the largest shapes. So I'm drawing several hair curls as like a cluster of shapes, if that makes any sense. And then once I got that cluster of shapes mapped out inside the hair, what I then do is I then start drawing all the smaller curls that lie inside of it. And again, I'm not really measuring at this point. I'm just drawing by feeling, just drawing what I think looks right. I don't care for perfectionism, I'm just... Because I feel like it's pointless whenever you're drawing things like hair. Just get the general shapes in there correctly, and then you can just kind of do whatever you want. Honestly, that's just... You can feel free to go crazy. But always work from large to small, not the other way around. And once you got the general details in there, then again, you can just start shading in, you know, just very lightly map the shadow shapes on the side of the hair. Try to find out. So right now I'm constructing all those cast shadows onto the face. Right now I'm just drawing the cast shadow of the head where it falls onto the neck. And then, yeah, just really light hatching strokes. They are not very dark at all. They're very light. And I'm paying very careful attention to the area at the front of the hair and the face. You know, like I'm trying to add a bit more contrast in those areas. And anything towards the back of the head and the back of the neck, I don't really tone at all in this drawing. I just let those hatching strokes kind of fade out towards the shadows of the back. And I try to enhance the contrast around the face and basically like the important areas, you could think of it. And that just gives the drawing a real sense of depth.